go ahead and, do I sound better to you?
PineCreek features the work of Canadian...
Can you hear me, Michael?
Yeah. You there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, but I'm going to have to find a different pair of headphones to plug in.
No problem. Take your time.
Won't take the Bluetooth ones. Hang on.
Yes, Franklin, you are first. 1,000 Pine points. Is this the first time a Christian has got Pine points?
Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're loud and clear to me.
Okay, that sounds better.
There we go. Okay, so you're in Atlanta, Georgia?
That's correct, a suburb, yep.
Okay, I'm in Tucson, Arizona. So this is a little early for
okay.
me. A little early, just a tad. But my voice is coming through. I had Robert Price on the show. I've had Dennis McDonald, Dr. Dennis R. McDonald, and Richard Carrier. I've had Richard Carrier talk to Dennis R. McDonald. And I promised Robert Price I'd buy one of his books, and so I'm going to do the same thing with you. So which book do you think, which book are you the most proud of here? I got it on the screen. Oh, actually, the one's blocked out, but that's...
I would say the two on the left, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, and The Resurrection of Jesus, the big one.
Which one, The Resurrection of Jesus, took you the most time to write, you think?
Yeah, but not by a significant amount of time. Let's see. The Resurrection of Jesus one took me probably 10 years, with just considering all the research and stuff behind it and reading. The one on Gospel Differences took me 8 years. The one on Gospel Differences is a lot shorter too, but it took almost as long as the big one.
Well, I don't know how much you know about me, but I used to be a Christian, professing Christian, if you're a Calvinist, for 30 years. So which book would likely make me back into a Christian?
That's up to you, Doug. No, and I don't know you. I don't really hang out too much online. So you're contacting me is the first I'd heard of you, but I guess the resurrection one, really, because I think we don't, as a non-believer, I'm sure you would agree that if Jesus rose, Christianity is most likely true. So,
yeah.
If you, everything stands and falls on the resurrection, kind of. So,
yeah,
that probably would be the one.
Yeah, I think most Christians would agree with that. The question is, number one, is it true? Number two, do you follow it? And those are two separate questions. I think if I were to become a Christian again, I'd probably be a Pete Enns type Christian. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Yeah, I
don't agree with him in everything, but he's a good guy. And he does Old Testament, and that's not my field, so it's hard to even comment. I can't even really comment on the stuff he does because I just don't know when it comes to Old Testament.
One thing I want to start off with is, and by the way, welcome to people in the live stream chat. It looks like everything's working. Let me know if something isn't. And if you guys have questions for Dr. Licona later, tag me now at PineCreek, and that way I can easily see it. If you don't tag me, I'm not going to see it. But Mike, I want to talk to you about biases first, because I think
Sure.
I really appreciate what I've heard you say about biases, and that you really try hard to lower your biases. And I think we all have it. We all have confirmation bias. But I'm going to read some quotes that you have said, and I want you to hear your thoughts on it. This is from, I watched you on Mormon Stories. I forget the gentleman's name who hosts that.
Yeah, he was a neat guy. I forgot his name too, but
Is it
he was a
Jonathan?
really good host.
But anyhow, you said, what we have to fear is that our biases will be so strong that they will blind us from seeking and discovering truth, and it may cost us eternity. That is my greatest fear. Now, part of the reason why I think I left Christianity is because that fear was removed. I kind of I said to myself, I value truth so much that I'm willing to go to hell for it. And now that really doesn't make sense, because if you don't believe in Christianity is true, you're not going to believe probably hell exists and so forth. But that's almost the attitude I think I had to have had in order to start to really ask the deep questions about Christianity. I had to have that attitude that I was willing to go to hell. But when I hear you say this, that your greatest fear is costing eternity, am I hearing you right, that you're worried about losing eternal salvation or going to hell?
No, no. What I was saying there, what I meant in that is our biases, as you said correctly at the beginning, we're all biased, and we all wear our biases like a pair of sunglasses. They're tinted to different degrees, different colors. We all see things differently. Someone may look at some evidence, some data, some arguments, find them persuasive. Some may not find them persuasive at all. I look at the evidence, I see it a certain way. I try to look at things as honestly as I can. I'm not perfect, so my biases are going to impact the way I see, the way I interpret things at times. And at times I'm going to be mistaken. As honest as I try to be with myself at times, I know I'm going to make mistakes. So my fear is when I was doing my study on the resurrection, doing my doctoral work, I got into it in order to create an apologetic. But that was thrown out the window about a year into it. I no longer had that objective. It was to find and follow truth. And what I was really, really afraid of is that my biases as a Christian, wanting the resurrection to be proven, wanting it to be true, my fear was that those biases would keep me from discovering truth. And if another religion was true, like Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, it could cost me eternity. Well, Hinduism and Buddhism, if I'm wrong, I'll get another chance. I'll get an endless number of chances in order to get it right. But if Islam is correct, or if some other monotheistic religion that has an exclusivist teaching, if that is correct, then it could cost me eternity, and that's what I feared.
I see. So it's not so much of Christianity, but the other religions. If you don't find the truth in other religions, if they are true, it could cost you eternity.
Yeah, it's kind of like, the Muslim raised as a Muslim is going to be very convinced, very dogmatic about their Muslim beliefs. And it's hard to get out of that paradigm there, that mindset where you've been raised a certain way, you think it's true, or whatever. We live in a culture that's very secular. It's easy to go the other way because being a Christian is countercultural today. And, there's just so many different influences out there that can take us away and blind us to the data.
But like the two largest religions in the world, Islam and Christianity, they also have the greatest concept of heaven and the baddest concept of hell. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I kind of wonder that if our mind is focused in on eternity when we're trying to figure out what's true, that's the quickest way to cloud our judgment, is when we're worried about, this bad afterlife, or desiring this good afterlife. Like, shouldn't we approach these texts from the viewpoint of, well, it's probably not true, that there's this eternity afterlife, but maybe it is. Let's find out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm not. No, I'm not going to go by a methodical skepticism. I think that's every bit as flawed as a methodical credulity that says we're just going to assume this is true until it's shown otherwise. I think we have to approach texts and views and say, with as neutral as possible, and look at the data and decide from there. And some things are really bad, and if they're really bad, then we should take extra care. If they're super important, I mean, hopefully you're going to make a better, more informed, more deliberate, more educated choice in who you're going to marry than choosing your next car, or whether you're going to get fat-free milk or 2% milk at the grocery store. The more important the decision, you're going to consider things a little bit more. And if eternity is truly at stake, if there is something like a hell, then we do well to think very carefully about it and to take it seriously. Now, I would say that when you say that Christianity and Islam have some of the worst views of hell, the most horrific views of hell, I would just like to point out that not all of Christians think of hell as a Dante's Inferno, where there's a divine torture chamber. I mean, C.S. Lewis, in The Great Divorce, there's a metaphorical kind of view of hell that says hell is a real place, but the tortures, the fire and things like that are metaphors for judgment. And there's probably a lot of truth in that. And then there are a number of other people like a John Stott and F.F. Bruce who would embrace an annihilationist view that would say that there's some sort of a punishment that takes place for someone like a Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, things like that. And then you just fade off into non-existence. I hope that is true for the non-believers, rather than more of a literal or even a metaphorical view where you're eternally quarantined away from the presence of God. And it may be. I mean, there's some verses to support that. I just don't know. I don't focus on those things. That's not been one of my areas of
what do you hope is true? That
research.
I'd
like to see the annihilationist. The annihilationist view that F.F. Bruce, John Stott, and some others hold. I'm not saying it is true. I tend to think it's not, but I hope it is. I think there are some reasons to think it is, but that would say that, like, for example, when Jesus talks about hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, he's taking that from the end of Isaiah. And in that chapter, the picture is of Israel's enemies being all killed and their bodies, their corpses just piled up on this big pile. Maggots are eating away at the flesh, and you set it on fire to burn the corpses up so that disease doesn't spread. And what he's saying is the smoke of their torment ascends forever. It's basically saying that your enemies are never going to bother you again because they no longer exist. Okay. God has defeated Israel's enemies. So I think one can make a case that when we talk about eternal punishment, it is not necessarily conscious punishment, but it's kind of like when a person is killed or executed, you're saying, I am eternally banished. We are eternally banishing you from life on earth. Okay, but the punishment itself is not a conscious punishment. Now, again, I know that there are counter arguments to that and things like that. I'm not here to argue about the nature of hell. Because I'm not an expert and I've not really given a lot of research to it. What I'm just saying here, Doug, as you know already, is that Christians aren't necessarily committed to a
Yeah,
fire and brimstone hell.
I talk to a lot of Christians who believe in annihilation or universal, everybody goes to heaven, and I just call them weak-kneed liberal Christians, and they laugh and we chuckle about it. But I actually think that if the traditional concept of hell goes away from Christianity, Christianity is toast. It's done. I think that concept is needed in order to keep, because why would a guy like me need Christianity, even if it's true? Let's assume it's true. Why would a guy like me need it if there's no hell? Because number one, I don't desire heaven. I don't desire to live forever. So, me living 100 years and then being annihilated is not a bad way to go. And I don't need God to pay my electric bill. I don't need God to, help me get through the day. I don't suffer from anxieties or depression. Why do I need Jesus then if there's no hell? And I've told Christians many times, if hell's real, that is a good reason. If it's a really bad, bad place, that's a good reason to become a Christian. And then I ask them,
Yeah.
am I wrong to say, that's a good reason to become a Christian? And I've yet to find a Christian say, no, you shouldn't become a Christian just because of hell. They say, no, that's a consideration.
Well, that's why I became a Christian.
Really?
At age 10. At age 10, that's why I became a Christian.
Me too. Yeah, I was terrified.
So, but I would say, if you don't, let's say you get to live 100 years and then you don't want heaven, you just want to be annihilated. If annihilation view of hell is true, then you'll probably get your wish. For me, I prefer to think of heaven. I don't want to think of this life as all that there is. I have two parents who have died within the last 6 years. I've missed them a lot. I miss my grandparents. I would like to see them again. Very much like to see them again. I think of, especially, and I have a pretty nice life. I'm sure you have a pretty nice life. Most of us in the U.S. do.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those, living in third world countries where, there's a lot of injustice that is going on. There's sex trafficking, there's slavery, all kinds of things. I mean, you live in a kind of brutal world like that. You'd like to think that justice is going to be done, that the evil are going to be punished, that the righteous will be rewarded, that this life isn't all there is. I'm not saying that therefore that kind of reality is true just because you wish it's true, like a Peter Pan kind of thing. But yeah,
Yeah,
I hope heaven is true.
to me, yeah, I don't desire to live forever, but I want to get back to biases, and then I want to move on to the history part. Like, if a Mormon was to have doubts, you and I probably both agree that Mormonism is false, the core propositions. But if a Mormon were to have doubts, and they take those doubts and they pray to God to help them see the truth of the Book of Mormon, I think you and I would say that's not a good approach to lower our biases. Would you agree with that?
What do you mean to lower our biases?
For that Mormon
is
to
that
lower
a method?
Yeah, for that Mormon.
Is that a method for lowering biases?
Would it be good? It would be a good way for that Mormon to lower his or her biases by saying, okay, I'm doubting the Book of Mormon. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pray to God to help me see the truth in the Book of Mormon. Would you say that's a good way to lower biases?
No, I mean, that's not the way I'd go about it. And that's not the way I went about it. I looked and I contacted some Book of Mormon archaeologists at Brigham Young University and asked them some tough questions. I did a little research of my own and
But
became convinced that it wasn't true.
But Michael, I want to read what you said in your book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and maybe you can clarify for me.
Are you talking about the white book, the little one?
Yes, I believe so. But you can tell me, I have been able to experience what I believe was a neutral position for a number of brief periods. During these, I have been so uncertain of what I believe in terms of Jesus' resurrection that I prayed for God's guidance and continued patience if the Christianity I was now doubting is true. Do you remember where that's from?
Maybe the introduction
Now,
of the big book.
Now, what did you mean by that? When I'm sensing you're in a period of doubt, you're wondering why, if any of this is true, maybe, and you pray to God for guidance and patience. I'm visualizing you the same way I am that Mormon I just described. Am I
Okay.
wrong here?
But, well, I think it's incomplete, Doug. The way you describe the Mormon is, all right, I'm having doubts about the Book of Mormon. God, lead me to show me whether this is true. The state I was in when I was doing my doctoral research on the resurrection is I'm not just praying and asking God for guidance. I'm actually doing the research. I'm working toward minimizing my personal biases. I'm working very hard at that as I'm doing this research. And I'm reading atheists and agnostics and liberals and conservatives and moderates and trying to take in all this stuff and make an intellectual, logical assessment of the data. And at the same time, I'm praying, God, look, I believe Christianity is true, but I am open to it being false. If it's false, please show me. Let me see it. Let me, as I debate Ehrman or someone, I don't care if I have to be humiliated, just show me that it's false. I want to follow truth. I wasn't questioning God's existence at that point. I think that the evidence for God's existence is quite strong. So it would be a matter of, is Christianity true? Do I jettison Christianity in favor of more of a general idea of God? God is the creator of the universe. I don't know much about him. I'm just going to try to live a good life. That would kind of be the option that I would be looking at if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So I'm just reaching out to God in all sincerity and saying, look, if I'm wrong here, I want to know it. But at the same time, I'm doing my homework. I'm doing my research. And to that extent, I think that's different than the Mormon that you talked about, hypothetical Mormon, who's questioning and just
Okay.
prays to God to show it's true.
I understand the difference. Like, you're saying not only did you pray, but you also did the research. But you and I both know, and probably know personally, Mormons or people of other faiths who have done tremendous amount of research in their own belief system that you and I would deem false, and they come out the other side even becoming more convinced. And so, like, when I value truth, when I say I'm actually believing something true, I'm not dogmatic on almost anything. Like, the only things I'm dogmatic about is that when I let go of this pen, it's going to fall towards the ground. Those are the types of things I'm dogmatic about, and I'll fight to my death for it. And so I just, when we have people of different faiths, different cultures, different geographies, all arriving at the same conclusion, then I think maybe, just maybe, we're onto something we call truth. But we don't find that in religion, do we? It's not even close.
Well, we don't, and we don't find it in politics,
Right.
Because personal biases definitely get involved. And look, I mean, there have been atheists who have left atheism and become Christians. So, I mean, we could just say it's not just religion involved; it's worldviews. So, I mean, there's different biases involved. I agree with you. We can't know something with 100% certainty. I remember telling my dad, I'm 85% certain Christianity's true. He got upset with me.
Oh,
But,
I believe it.
but that's kind of where I'm at. I think Christianity is true. I think it's borne out by the evidence, but
You're currently at 85%, would you say?
yeah, probably.
What would it take for you to get to 99? Why aren't you at 99?
It would probably take something like an appearance of Jesus to me or some more of a supernatural experience. I mean, I do think I've had some supernatural experiences, but then, at the time it's like, whoa, okay, I'm 100% certain. And then as time goes on, you kind of forget those things.
Yeah.
And you move on and life gets in the way.
I know exactly what you mean. The same thing happened to me. I think back when I was 19, I had some amazing experiences, and they all seem to happen between 18 and 22 for some weird reason. But now I look back and I can easily explain them away, easily. But I agree with you. In order for me to become a Christian, I would need to see an amazing miracle, an amazing one, firsthand, that, not some claim from 2,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away. But that's interesting. Like, that you and I are actually very similar in that regard. Except my starting point is not 85%. My starting point is probably 2%. But I tell you, I'd probably jump up to 85% right away if, you have an Iraqi war vet have their limb prayed for, their missing limb prayed for in Jesus' name, and it came back.
Well, Doug, I have a friend named Loy Reed, and in June of 1987, he was in a car wreck, and it put him in a coma for a while. And on July 4th, 1987, he was still in a coma with 6 other people in the room who had all been in a coma for more than a month. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, miles away from the hospital, his church, a number of the members were on a 4th of July picnic, and they all got together and they prayed for Loy. He'd been in a coma for 21 days at that point. And at 4 o'clock, while they were praying in the hospital miles away, Loy came out of his coma.
I'm sorry, Michael, that does nothing for me. You know why?
Well, maybe it doesn't for you. It does for me. It did for Loy. I mean, that's pretty good coincidence, don't you think?
I would say no. I would say not only is it that it's not good enough miracle for me, it shouldn't be for you either. And here's why. There's probably hundreds of millions of people on this planet right now with cancer, a terminal type of cancer. But a small percentage of those will go into remission on its own. And a great portion of those patients with cancer that go into remission are praying to a deity that the cancer will go away. And sure enough, it does. Now, isn't that an amazing coincidence? Like, there's 7 billion people on the planet. Probably 100 of them today, right now, are praying that God will remove their cancer. And it actually happens. Is that a miracle? I say not even close. Not even, we haven't even started yet. That's, like, I want to see someone with, let's say, a crushed eyeball in some type of horrible accident, and God uncrush it. That type of miracle. Someone coming out of a coma, it's not going to do it for me. But can we?
Okay, but that's you. Listen, I've had both my parents in the last 6 years have died of cancer, and 6 years ago, this past Thanksgiving, my mom was declared cancer-free, and she and my dad were declaring it a miracle and asked what I thought, and I said, not so fast. Mm-hmm. You've been having treatment. This thing can go into remission for a little bit, and it may come back. And it did just a few months later, and it took her life. Where I think the story of Loy Reed is different is here he was in this coma, and it is the context in which he comes back. It's the timing. It's not only the prayer, but it's the timing. So maybe just to make it a little more simpler, if a guy who's been born blind, and let's just say he's 50 years old, and one afternoon he and his wife are having lunch together, and all of a sudden he just gets his eyesight, and they go to the physician and they have no idea what happened. I wouldn't declare that a miracle. I would declare that an anomaly. But if the guy and his wife are sitting having lunch and the knock at the door, and they open it, and the pastor, and he says, "Hey, excuse me, I know we've never met, but I'm the pastor down the street, and I was just having lunch with my staff, and we prayed, and we all had this strong feeling that I had to come down to your house and sing the first stanza of Amazing Grace, and I know that sounds really weird, but would you allow me to do it?" And they said, "Well, okay." And so he does. And Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And thanks, folks. And let you know we're down the street. You're welcome to come down anytime. We'd love to see you. And he leaves. And as the wife closes the door, she looks, and her husband has tears coming down his eyes. And he says, "When he said was blind, but now I see, I received my sight." Now, the difference between that and the first scenario is the second one occurs in a context that's charged with religious significance. It's the timing of everything. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's present with Loy coming out of the coma. That's a little bit different than praying about the cancer.
My way to respond to that is to always put it into another belief system and then see if a person would react the same way. So I had a guy named Max on a week or two ago, I questioned him. He sincerely believes in Krishna, a version of Hinduism. And if he were to tell the same story of a friend who was in a coma and he prayed to Krishna, and at the exact moment he prayed to Krishna, his friend came out of a coma, would you believe in Krishna anymore? Like, seriously?
Yeah, I mean that would be a challenge to me, Doug. I'm not against God answering prayers in other religions. I
No,
think
no,
it does
don't.
happen
Your
at
God is
times.
false. In this prayer, he's praying the not the false God of Christianity, not the false God of Judaism, the true God
I
of
understand
Krishna.
what you're
Yeah,
saying.
it's not a
He's
demon
praying
doing
to
it.
Krishna, and it seems like Krishna answers that prayer. That would be a problem for me. I'm not saying I would deny that it happened. I would, if we checked into the evidence and the evidence pointed out, I would acknowledge the miracle, and I would have to take that into consideration with my theology.
Because there's what's the guy's name? I'm sure you're familiar with him. Sai Baba, the East Indian guru. Have you heard of him?
No.
He has millions of followers, and he died, I think, in the 90s. Someone can fact check me on that. But he apparently rose people from the dead. People believe that he's done miracles for them. And there's millions of these people today who follow this guy. You can look them up on the internet. And you can talk to these people and look in their eyeballs and ask them about their miracle experiences. And they'll tell you, this guy is God in flesh. He healed me of my cancer or so forth. He raised so-and-so from the dead. But I don't think you and I would believe it for 1 second, even after talking to these people face to face and hearing these stories.
Well, it's hard to say that. At least it's hard for me to say what I would think after interviewing them because I haven't interviewed them.
Okay, let's move on to the history. Where the time is going fast, and I do just to let you know, I do a speed round a lot with my guests. I did it with Robert Price and
I like
Dennis
Bob. He's cool.
Yeah, I like him too. And Dennis McDonald, I did a speed round, and so I'm going to ask a lot of the same questions I asked them. But I warn you, they're a little tough. So, but I first want to talk about the history part. I kind of appreciate when you say that the Gospels give us the gist of what happened 2,000 years ago. But I'm just thinking back in my evangelical Christian days, and if I was to hear a New Testament historian use the word gist, I would feel a little, something's not sitting right with me because this is the inspired word of God, and you're calling it a gist? Is the inspired word of God a gist? Can you explain to me exactly what you mean by gist, and does the historian Michael conflict with the Christian Michael when you use the word gist? Because I think you view this as inspired texts.
I do. And I don't think that there's any conflict there. The fact is that we don't know. Those of us who believe the Bible is God's inspired word, we don't know the mechanism or mechanisms that he would have used in order to inspire it. So if we don't know the mechanisms, we're not exactly sure of what the end product should look like. So what we have to do is look at the end product and then speculate on on how the process of inspiration worked. So, we look at the Gospels, and I mean, well, let's just say this. Let's say you and I are sitting in a restaurant having dinner, and some guy comes in with a gun and he starts shooting, and then someone who's carrying a weapon shoots this guy, and then the police come and then they ask you and me to write down what we witnessed. Well, we might be our descriptions might have all the details correct, but we're not going to use the same wording. And so and especially if, let's say, we were both fluent in Spanish and the gunman that came in was yelling at a woman in Spanish and the police asked us to write down in English what he had said. And then if our accounts were virtually verbatim, they would know that we were not writing independently. So when we look at, say, the Synoptic Gospels, and we see a lot of verbatim, in the sayings and teachings of Jesus, and even in the narrative, when we see parenthetical information, like in Jesus's Olivet Discourse, in his last week, and he's talking about Jerusalem as being surrounded in the last days. And then he says, let the reader, when the abomination of desolation, sits where it's unlawful, parenthetical statement, let the reader understand. And we find that same statement verbatim in the same place in Matthew and Mark. We know that there's some dependence between Matthew and Mark going on. So whatever inspiration method that God used, he allowed these authors to use sources. They allowed Matthew to use Mark. That's not a problem in the inspiration process. So what is Mark writing down? What is Luke and John writing down? Are they, were there scribes that as Jesus is teaching, are they writing down word for word, or are they recalling what Jesus had said? On numerous, probably Jesus spoke the same thing hundreds and hundreds of times that they heard it, and they're recalling it from memory. They're putting it in a form that they can recall, and so they're giving us a gist rather than a transcript.
But I'm sure you can appreciate, and again, I'm talking from my past Christian days. I think you can appreciate why some evangelicals would not like that term "gist" when applying to their sacred inspired scriptures. They're basically saying, well, we really don't know what Jesus said then, do we?
Well, we may not know his exact wordings, but I think that when you look and you say, Jesus probably didn't just teach this one time. He was an itinerant speaker. They probably heard him hundreds of times say this stuff. And then they had time where he could explain it. And I'm one of the things that the Gospels, at minimum, Mark and John are rooted in eyewitness testimony, Luke too. When you see these things, I think we have good reason to think that they are preserving an essentially faithful representation of what Jesus said. Is it his exact words? No. And especially when we take into consideration he probably spoke in Aramaic a large majority of the time, and we are reading it in Greek. And when these Greek words in Matthew, Mark, and Luke a lot of times are virtually verbatim, they're using one another as sources at times, which would not have been at all unusual for an ancient biographer to do. They're using oral tradition that had probably been formalized over the years. And these disciples, it's not like they're just trying to recall something that happened 30, 20, 40 years before. Not only had they heard this hundreds of times from Jesus, they had continued to preach it over the decades and kept it alive. So we're getting a good gist.
Okay, fair enough. I want to ask you about something that I think most people who are not professional historians, just people off the street who are not Christians, what they struggle with. And that is the simple thing like you shouldn't believe a man rose from the dead just because an old text says so. So I want to ask you a question. If I were to hand you a book, but you don't have the cover, you don't know who it's from, when it was written, where it was written, none of that. But you and I are assigned a task of putting this book in the libraries in a section, either the history section or the fiction section. And we open up the book, you and I, and we read one page, just one page. And the page says that a man ran fast and jumped off a cliff and flew. Now, you and I look at each other in the eyes and we say, okay, I ask you, would you lean this, just shift it towards the history section or the fiction section? Just based on that one page about a man flying unaided.
Well, given everything you just said, okay, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. We only see the one page and it talks about a man jumping off a cliff and flying. I would tend to put it in the fiction section.
Okay. I would too. And so this is what boggles my mind, because I think you and I are similar in our epistemologies, our prior probabilities. Now, let's say we figure out that this book was written 2,000 years ago, but that's the new piece of information added. 2,000-year-old text, but flying man. Does this shift this at all back into history for you, or it doesn't for me? It's still in the fiction.
We don't know who the authors are, and we don't have any other part of the text. We just have that one page. No, that doesn't change a thing for me.
Okay. Now let's say we find out that yeah, this is an anonymous author. We've read through the book. Nowhere does it say who the author is. Still in fiction, right?
No, no, not necessarily. With only two exceptions, every other ancient biography are they don't have the author's name in
No.
in
But
the
it started,
title or the preface.
but it started in you and I agreed that it started in the fiction section based on being a flying man.
Right.
My question to you is just the fact that we now know it's an anonymous author. Does that shift it back towards history even in the slightest?
If it's anonymous, no, of course not.
Yeah. Okay. Now
Well,
let's
I
say,
guess the point I was just making, if the author's name does not appear in the document, it doesn't mean that we don't know who wrote it or have any idea who wrote it. But in your example here of one page of an anonymous document that one page describes that was written 2,000 years ago and talks about a man jumping off a cliff and flying, no, we would put it in the fiction section.
okay, so it's right now it's still in the fiction section based on what we know. Now you see what I'm doing here, and I'm layering in the cumulative case for Christianity, and I can say we read another page in the book and says that 500 people saw the man fly, but they don't mention their names. You and I think, am I wrong to assume that you and I would still keep it in the fiction section?
Yeah, but that's not at all what we have for Christianity. We've got
hang on, but
no less than 9 authors writing within a few decades of the events, and much of it can be verified historically,
Mike,
and we have pretty good idea who wrote these gospels.
I know we're pressed for time, but I submit to you that I could layer in one at a time every single piece of evidence for the Gospels, and you would still not move the flying man back into the history section. It's only when you like pile it all together and put it in a big cauldron and stir it together do we say, oh, now we got history. But I think
That's what historians do, Doug. We don't look at we don't just isolate one thing out. We take all of the data into consideration. So it's not just the Christians who were claiming this. You also had Paul, who was persecuting Christians, who all of a sudden becomes one because he says the risen Jesus appeared to him and he's willing to suffer, and he eventually gets martyred for that belief. And it's not just one person who is testifying to this. We have multiple people who are testifying. We have early testimonies.
Testifying to what?
That Jesus rose from the dead.
Who
so we
besides
have
Paul?
early testimonies. We have eyewitness testimonies.
Who do we have
We
besides
have one
Paul?
that was hostile. Well, you've got eyewitness testimony of an apostle that's rooted in the Gospel of John, maybe even written by that eyewitness. In the Gospel of
Maybe.
Mark, the earliest,
I appreciate
the majority.
because
well,
a lot of
the
Christians would
majority-
say, sorry to interrupt, but this is a very important what you just said. A lot of Christians would just immediately say, yes, John is an eyewitness account that says that he saw the risen Jesus. But I appreciate the fact that you said probably, because it actually doesn't say that, does it?
Yeah, it does say he was an eyewitness.
That John was the eye. Does it say like the same way it says for Paul, that Paul says, I, Paul, saw the risen Jesus, he appeared to me?
Oh, no, not within John.
Right.
It talks about the beloved disciple, which most scholars today, and I'm taking this not from my own research, but from Craig Keener, who's written a magnificent 2-volume commentary on John, has probably dealt with this issue more than anyone else in terms of the historicity of a lot of things within that gospel, and has actually looked at what most scholars are saying on this today. I mean, this guy is an encyclopedia, and he says the majority of scholars today think, when it comes to John, Johannine scholars, specialists, think that the author of John's gospel, they do deny that it was John, the son of Zebedee. Keener thinks it was the son of Zebedee, John, but he says the majority of scholars today, specialists in John, they deny that it was John, the son of Zebedee, but they do think that the author of John's gospel was either A, one of Jesus's minor disciples who had traveled with him, or B, the author used as their primary source an eyewitness, one of Jesus' disciples, perhaps even John, the son of Zebedee. So either way, I mean, I haven't really looked at this in the kind of depth to be able to opine on it as an authority, But if that's what the majority of scholars are saying, and of course they could be wrong, but I have looked at enough to
But we
think
don't
that
have, but other than Paul, we don't have a person who identifies himself in the first person and says, "I saw the risen Jesus in bodily form," do we?
okay, but the fact that it was it's not that John's written not in the first person is irrelevant. I mean, you've got Jesus spoke a lot in the third
It's
person
relevant to
when he
me.
said the Son of Man. Huh?
It's relevant to me.
Well, hang on a second. Jesus spoke a lot in the third person when he's saying the Son of Man, this is going to happen to the Son of Man, and the Son of Man is going to do this. You've got Polybius, the great historian, who spoke of himself consistently in the third person. You have Julius Caesar when he wrote the Gallic Wars and
Why didn't
his
Paul write in the
commentary.
third person?
Well, he just didn't. That wasn't his style. But Julius Caesar did entirely in the third person in his two major works.
But
So it's not like it's out of step for the author of John's Gospel if it was an eyewitness to write in the third person. And the fact that we have so much testimony that it was John, one of Jesus' disciples, who wrote John's Gospel, I don't think that's at all weakened by the fact that if it was one of those disciples, that it's written in the third person.
I want to bring this back to the flying man. Even if we knew the person's name, where they're from, when they wrote, where they wrote it, we still wouldn't believe that person saw a flying man. But we don't even have that with the Gospels. We have.
What if we do? We've got multiple independent sources. You've got John, you've got Mark, and you've got Paul, and we can show that Paul.
None of them
is
identify
getting
themselves, correct?
All right. It's irrelevant whether they identify themselves in the document. If you look at Plutarch's lives, he never identifies himself. His name doesn't appear in any of the 50 biographies that have survived that are attributed to him. Livy, the Roman historian, his name doesn't appear in any of it. Sallust, one of the greatest Roman historians, his name doesn't appear in any of the literature that he wrote.
Mike.
So
but we're talking
it's
about
irrelevant that.
Mike, we're talking about not just whether someone owns a dog or a cat. We're talking about someone being raised from the dead. If someone accused you of murder, but refused to give their name, where they're from, like that's a serious charge. That Mike Licona committed a murder, and you say, well, who's accusing me of this? I want to face my accuser. I want to know who's making this claim. Oh, it's anonymous.
Oh, okay, but that's not what we have with the Gospels in that even though the documents of the Gospels are anonymous, we still have some early testimony, especially when it comes to Mark and Matthew, of who wrote those. And then we have unanimous testimony for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and virtually unanimous testimony that John wrote it. So it's not like we have no idea. I mean, if we're going to say that about the Gospels, we also have to say that about Plutarch, Sallust, and Livy. And no classical scholar questions whether Plutarch wrote the lives or Sallust wrote the histories or the war with Catiline or the war with Jugurtha or Livy wrote the Roman histories.
When Plutarch talks about eyewitnesses, does he say who they are?
Mostly not.
But sometimes he does.
He doesn't necessarily do it. Like in one occasion, in his, I think it's his Life of Antony, he mentions how I think it was his grandfather told the story of how Antony had conscripted all the citizens of the city in which he lived. I forgot what it was. I don't know if it was Chaeronea, but he conscripted and forced all of them into labor to carry rice and goods down to the ships as he was, going into battle with, I think it was Octavian at that time. So occasionally you have that, but most of the time it is an indirect thing. So when he's talking about the Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, he said that Caesar stopped and deliberated and discussed the ramifications with his associates, one of whom was Asinius Pollio. And most classicists will say that was Plutarch's way of saying that Pollio provided that report. That's where he's getting it from.
Okay.
Because Pollio was there. Hey, and Pollio had written a history which is no longer extant.
Mike, I want to honor your, you said you had an hour, so I want to honor that. So I really want to get moving to the speed round and questions. So this is the speed round now, and so basically I want to just ask you true or false, but it's not like a firm dichotomy. You can say leaning true, leaning false. Um, do you agree with this quote from the Oxford Annotated Bible, page 1744, that neither the evangelists nor the first readers engaged in historical analysis? Their aim was to confirm Christian faith. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They thus do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. Do you agree with that or disagree?
I'd say most of that I would say is false and demonstrably so. And remember, these things are just written by various scholars with different biases. I recently, my son-in-law, with his assistance, we did a survey of Markan scholarship, critical scholars who had written critical commentaries on the Gospel of Mark and also New Testament introductions from 1965 to the present. So about 50 years worth. And we found 75 scholars, and the majority of them said that Mark was written between the years 50 and 70, and few of them put it after 70.
Okay, Mike,
that's only 20 years, 20 to 40 years.
okay, but so you're saying that you disagree with this. We have an Oxford Annotated Bible with something like 75 contributors to it.
But there was probably only one contributor who wrote that comment. And just like Bart Ehrman would say, we have no idea who wrote it. He's just flat out wrong and demonstrably so. Okay, when he says we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. When they say that, they're just wrong.
But the thing is, if you have a truth seeker out there who's listening and saying, well, who Mike is saying one thing, the Oxford Annotated Bible is saying another, who do I believe?
Well, they're going to have to do some research. I'd say, first of all, if you want to know if John, what the number of scholars who think John or that an eyewitness is behind the Gospel of John, read the introductory comments to Keener's commentary on John. If you want to know about Luke, read Keener's massive commentary on Acts and the first 624.
Or read...
You can read Ehrman too. It's
or
just
McDonald.
What I'm saying is Ehrman has not done the bean counting like Keener has on Luke and John.
I would love to do the bean counting.
I think it's important to go to the bean counters, the people who have really, really looked at this in depth, not the popular writers like Ehrman.
The reason why someone in the chat's asking about why I bring this up in the ages. The reason why the ages, when the Gospels are written, is very, very important. As apologists like J. Warner Wallace says, that if it was written in the late first century, odds are these people were, anybody who walked and talked with Jesus would be dead. Case closed.
Well, that's false. Jim Wallace is just wrong there. In fact, Robert MacIver in his book Memory, Jesus, and the Synoptic Gospels, I think it's 2007, published by the Society of Biblical Literature, not an evangelical publisher at all.
What's he false about?
About how the eyewitnesses wouldn't have been alive around when John was written in the last decade of the first century.
Probably.
MacIver does some MacIver does some study on this. He estimates based on multiple population estimates for that area of the Roman Empire during the time of Jesus. He estimates that Jesus probably would have come in contact with somewhere around 62,000 people ages 15 and above, and that by 1 to 1.5% would have survived to age 80 or beyond.
But that wrote the book of John?
Of the day,
That wrote the book of John? Are you saying Jesus walked and talked with 15-year-olds when he was 30?
You got to remember, 15-year-olds were a lot more mature back then than 15-year-olds today. In fact,
but is that what you're saying?
They were already involved. They were already involved in their full-time jobs. So what I'm saying is, the ages 15 and above, there would have been about 62,000 people that Jesus would have come in contact with. When Mark was written about 30 years later, there would have been 13 to 15,000 eyewitnesses still alive. And when John was written in the 90s, there would have been somewhere between 600 and 1,100 eyewitnesses still alive.
Even if there were 15, how old would they be in 95 AD?
Well, for saying they heard Jesus at around the year 30, then yeah. So we're looking at what, 60, 75 years old.
Which means there's odds are still that they're more likely to be dead than alive at that age. But anyhow, let's move on.
1.5% live to 80 and beyond, and that's where MacIver gets his numbers from.
I'm reminded of Robert Price when he said that when you find yourself giving explanations that gets you out of a tough spot, You got to ask yourself, are you doing this just because you desire this to be true? Like
Well, that's true. I don't think that's what's going on here. We're looking at statistics, Doug.
but
I'm
you're
surprised,
saying,
you just want to throw them out.
no,
And now you got to ask.
I'm
is
not
it your
throwing them
bias
out.
That's causing. you to
I'm
do
not throwing
this?
them out. I'm still saying, I'm sticking by my guns that anybody who walked and lived with Jesus would probably be dead by the year 95 AD when the Gospel of John was written. Do you disagree with that?
No, but given all the people that Jesus would have come in contact with, what MacGyver argues is there would have still been about 600 to 1,100 eyewitnesses still alive when John was written, and 13,000 to 15,000 still alive when Mark was written.
Is the probability that someone is alive to 70 years old today, like even that's like, I think 50-50 today?
Look, I have no idea for today. I'm just giving you the data.
Anybody
So
living over
if
the
Price
ages...
wants to say that nobody was alive, I want to see what data he has for that.
No. See, this is the problem that I think a lot of... sorry, Michael, but this is the difference between... There's a difference between saying nobody will be alive to probably someone is dead or alive. I'm not making a blanket statement that it's impossible. I'm making a probability statement, which is what history's about,
I think
right?
MacGyver has shown that it's probable 600 to 1,100 eyewitnesses would still have been alive in the 90s.
Okay, let's move on. Now, I want to ask you, true or false, from the viewpoint of consensus, New Testament consensus, that the first gospel was written A, prior to 65 AD or around, or B, after 65 AD. The first gospel. What would consensus say?
Well, like I said, my son-in-law and I, we went to Emory. We got 75 critical scholars writing on this since 1965.
A or B?
And the majority say it was written 50 to 70 AD. So you want to say 65? I'm just saying what the majority. There is no consensus on it, but the majority says that Mark was written between 50 and 70 AD. And by the way, the majority also think, and it's a slight majority. It's still a majority though, but the slight majority says that Mark's primary source was Peter, the apostle. And even though it's a slight majority, that is a far cry from Ehrman's claim. And the one that the Oxford Annotated Bible says that we have no idea who wrote the Gospels, and they aren't rooted in eyewitness testimony.
So you're saying
the majority of scholars
50
aren't
to 70.
saying that.
50 to 70.
50 to 70.
Okay.
And that surprised me because I always thought it was 65 to 70 is what the majority thought. It's 50 to 70.
True or false? The author of Mark cites his sources.
Not in a direct manner, possibly in an indirect manner, as Plutarch does.
Can you give one example of an indirect manner?
Well, I gave you the one with Plutarch and Asinius Pollio.
No, Mark.
It could vary. I know. I'm just giving you that from Plutarch. In Mark, it could be the case like when Mark mentions the women at the crucifixion or at the empty tomb. It could be that's because he's naming his witnesses. Or when the angel tells the women at the tomb, go tell the disciples and Peter that he's going ahead into Galilee, and there you will see him. It's possible that Peter was one of the sources there.
Okay.
I don't know.
So the author of Mark,
there's possibilities.
So the author of Mark does not cite his sources directly, but maybe indirectly. Okay.
Possibly indirectly.
True or false? The author of Mark identifies himself in the first person.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Very good. True or false? The other
He
Gospels...
doesn't identify himself in the third person. I mean, because he's not there. If he's getting his information from Peter, he's not going to be identifying himself in first, second, or third person. First or third person.
The other Gospels, other than Mark, are independent of Mark. True or false?
I would only say John was independent of Mark. He may have known of Mark, but he is certainly independent of Mark. And Matthew and Luke use Mark as their primary source, but they also supplement it with independent, like the Q material, special M, special L material.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say John maybe is independent, but not the
No,
others.
John is independent.
John is independent.
The others aren't.
Okay.
The others aren't entirely independent, but don't go as far as saying that Matthew and Luke are entirely dependent on Mark. They're not. They use other sources.
Okay. This one is not true or false. This one is what you agree, strongly agree, disagree. So this is actually a little easier because you don't have to put yourself in a binary box. The New Testament authors sometimes misquote the Old Testament. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree.
I would say that they use a charismatic exegesis, which was common for Jews in that day to do. We would say misquoting by our standards, but by their standards, I'd say no.
But okay. Number 2, there's contemporary evidence for the life and ministry of Jesus. Contemporary meaning during the life of Jesus and maybe even 5 years afterwards, after his death. Agree? Strongly agree?
5 years after his death? No, probably not, unless perhaps some of the oral tradition involved. I mean, you have even
That we have.
scholars like skeptical scholars like Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar and Gert Ludemann, who would say that some of the oral tradition, like we have in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, goes back to within months, 2 to 3 years at most, they would say. Now, I think that is a little bit generous. It could go back that far, but I don't know that we could actually say that. And that's skeptical scholars.
We have
atheist
zero
scholars saying that.
True or false? We have zero evidence during the life of Jesus. Things that we have found, written, produced during the life of Jesus, dated to that time.
During the life of Jesus, about Jesus, yeah, we don't have that.
And we don't even have it 5 years and probably even 10 years after, correct?
Well, we might with the oral tradition.
No, but oral is not something we can touch.
It's still evidence. It's and it has been embedded in Paul's letters. So it is.
But Paul's letters are written in 55 or so, right? So that wouldn't count.
So why wouldn't it count? You mean to tell me that if someone is writing,
this question is about
you mean to tell me if someone is writing
35.
about the Civil War today, the American Civil War, but quoting from a letter written by a veteran of the Civil War, that doesn't count?
Yes, it does not count for this question because the question is from Jesus' birth to his death and plus 10. Do we have anything written about him? Any evidence at all? Any inscriptions? Anything? I think we're both agreed the answer is no. Correct?
Yeah. If you want to phrase it the way you have phrased it, that it has to be in writing and it had to be written down at that time, then that would be correct.
Well, it can't be in the ether because the oral traditions those people are all dead now. So it would have to be passed on in a different way. Number 3.
Well, if the message, though, is preserved later in writing, then we still have it.
The gospel reports events that we would expect to be recorded by others.
Perhaps. I mean, you got Ulysses Grant's 2 volumes on the American Civil War, his memoirs, never mentions the Emancipation Proclamation. We'd expect that. In Josephus's autobiography, we would expect that he would mention his capture by the Romans.
I'm hearing and agree.
Yet he makes no mention of it. So it's not unusual. The Romans just wrote about things that applied to them. The Christians wrote about things that applied to them. They rarely mentioned things like Augustus or Tiberius.
Do you think the Romans would write about 3 hours of darkness at Jesus' resurrection? Or do you think that didn't happen? If it did happen, do you think some Romans would have written about it?
Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe it was just bad
depends
weather.
Why they. Maybe it depends why they were writing. You know.
Number 4, the Gospels present eyewitness. Oh, we already talked about this. Number 5, Luke was a companion of Paul who carefully recorded some of the history of Jesus.
Yes.
Strongly agree?
Yes.
Okay. Number 6.
Yeah. In fact, I would say this just to add. Keener's results in studying the book of Acts and Gospel of Luke, all this, he says the majority of scholars on Luke Acts today think that the author of Luke Acts was a traveling companion of Paul. Now, they don't go so far to say that person's name was Luke, but they say it was a traveling companion of Paul who also got information from eyewitnesses. But Keener says Luke is really the only good candidate for it. But anyway, that's where the majority are today.
Let me know if I got the basic gist of the attestations of how we know who wrote what. So around the 4th century, a guy named Eusebius says a guy named Papias, who we have no zero writings of, says a guy named John, who we're not sure who that is exactly, says a guy named Mark, says a guy named Peter, says a guy named Jesus said such and such. Do I basically have that right?
No, you've gone a few layers beyond what it's really saying there. But if
I'm
you're going
too
to go
detailed?
really, if you're going to go that way, Doug, I mean, you could do that for so many other things. Are you saying Plutarch says that Asinius Pollio says that Caesar
But
said
was I
this
wrong with what I
and so
said?
forth? Well, I think you went a couple of layers different than I would. I'd say that Eusebius had before him the uh, discourses of Jesus reported by Papias. And Papias, sometime in the late first century, early second century, heard from an associate of one of Jesus's disciples, probably John, the son of Zebedee, but an eyewitness, and heard while that disciple was still alive and preaching that about the authorship of Mark and Matthew. And that's pretty darn good because that means that Papias heard that sometime in the late first century within only a few decades of when Matthew and Mark had been written.
A few
And he's hearing
decades?
it from someone who got this from Jesus' disciple.
When you say a few decades, you're saying 50 years, right? If the
If
majority is,
Papias, yeah. Yeah, let's say Papias hears this, let's just say 95, okay? We don't know exactly, but Papias would have heard this in sometime in the last quarter of the first century. So let's just put it at 95. And let's say Mark is written 50 to 70. Let's take an in-between date of 60. So he's hearing this
50 years.
or he's hearing 35 years after Mark had written, but he's hearing it from someone who had walked with and knew one of Jesus' eyewitness disciples while that disciple is still alive and teaching.
But Papias' writings we don't have them, right? When do they?
Well, the preserved fragments, as we do with many ancient authors, we have some of what they say that's preserved in the writings of others.
But I'm basically not wrong with what I said. I said that a guy named Eusebius in the 4th century,
Okay.
like 300 or 400 years after Jesus, says that a guy named Papias, we've got to take Eusebius' word for it, right? Says a guy named Papias who wrote in the early 1st century, 2nd century,
Probably late
Yeah.
first, early second.
which we have zero writings of. It's only preserved through Eusebius and maybe Irenaeus or someone else. Which is 50 years after the first Gospels and close to 100 years or maybe 70 years after Jesus, the purported events, saying a guy named John, who we're not sure who that is, says that a guy named Matthew or Mark or Luke.
When you say you're not sure who he is, well, he's one of Jesus' disciples. Most scholars do think he's referring to John, the son of Zebedee, but some think that he's referring to a minor disciple.
Now,
But Doug, let me ask you this, okay? Do you think Plutarch wrote the lives?
it doesn't matter to me if he did or not. I don't know.
Do you think that he did?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I asked the leading Plutarch scholar in the world, and he said there's no debate on whether Plutarch wrote the lives. And yet the best evidence we have for that is is a document called the Lamprias Catalog, written at least 100 years and maybe as much as 200 or more years later, and it's falsely attributed to his son. And there's no debate over whether Plutarch wrote it.
Do these writings, does it have my eternal destination in mind?
It's irrelevant right now. It's irrelevant. You're calling
No, it's not irrelevant.
No. What I would say here, and Plutarch's not the only one. Sallust, one of the greatest Roman historians, his histories that he wrote, of which only have survived in fragments.
Michael,
we've
earlier
lost a bunch
when we
of it.
first started this discussion,
What we have for Sallust is the earliest guy for his histories is Seneca the Elder, who writes 75 years later. And what we have for his War of Catiline and his war with Jugurtha, which have been preserved in their entirety, is the first guy is Quintilian, who's
I agree with you,
mentioned this
Michael.
more than 135 years later. And Sallust scholars,
I agree with
there's
you,
no
Michael,
debate on
that-
whether Sallust wrote this.
I agree with you that they're all bad.
All bad. Well, they're sufficient so that you don't have a single classicist who calls these into question. The point I would like to make is, yeah, they're not perfect. The evidence we could have for Plutarch's lives and the literature by Sallust could be a lot better. The evidence we have for the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could be a lot better. But what we have is far superior to what we have for Plutarch and Sallust. And classicists do not at all question whether Plutarch and Sallust wrote these. So the thing is, are there any competing authors? And no, there are no competitors in terms of who wrote these. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right. It's Plutarch and Sallust. So we might not have perfect evidence, but we do have evidence that I think is sufficient to conclude about their authorship.
Okay.
So you can do it all you want to try to call it into question. But when people devote their lives to looking at these issues, like with the classical literature and the biblical literature, we go with where does the evidence point? And the evidence may not be unimpeachable, may not be perfect, but it's it's decent enough.
Mike, I really want to, do you see where I'm coming from? Can you at least empathize a little bit that if we were talking about anything else, like this flying man, and if I said to you, you need to believe in the flying man because it's a fact of history. Now, and you ask me, Doug, how do you know about the flying man? And I say, well, about 300 or 400 years after the flying man, a guy says that another guy 100 years after the flying man said that one of the followers of the flying man says that this guy wrote about the flying man and saw the flying man. Like, you and I, not for 1 second, would say, oh, this is great evidence for the flying man.
Well, yeah, but if you have multiple people who are saying this, well, then that increases the probability. Then we look at that a little more carefully. And it's not just the Gospels. You do have Justin Martyr, who writes around the year 150, and he quotes the Gospels on about a dozen occasions and refers to them as the memoirs of the apostles. And it's virtually verbatim with what we have in the Gospels. So we can at least say there that even if he's not identifying the authors, this tradition that we find in our Gospels was known in the middle of the 2nd century as coming from the apostles. It was the memoirs of the apostles. And then we got Paul, who had been a skeptic. I mean, that's pretty good. You put all that together, again, it's an accumulation of the evidence.
I don't think you would believe it for 1 second if it was a flying man. If a persecutor of the flying man came to believe 2 years after the flying man's death that the flying man actually flew and existed and wrote about it, would you seriously believe in the flying man just because someone who didn't like the flying man wrote about it afterwards and became a flying man follower?
Doug, if we had the same kind of evidence for the flying man that you're talking about as we have for the resurrection of Jesus, I would have to consider it.
You'd have to consider it?
I'd have to give it some serious consideration.
Why wouldn't you automatically believe it if we had exactly what we had for the evidence for the Gospels?
I probably would. So when you can present that kind of evidence for the flying man, and you say you have it, then, if I think that you're telling the truth, then maybe I can look at it.
I honestly think that there are claims today that you don't believe that has better evidence than the Gospels.
It's possible. Okay. It's possible. I am not a perfect person. I'm not a perfect historian. All I can say is I try to look at things objectively. I'm going to fail at times, but I think the evidence is sufficient. Historical evidence is sufficient to conclude that Jesus rose from the dead.
Okay. Do you have time for questions? I know we went over. I apologize for that.
Yeah, let's go for another 5 minutes.
Okay. So if anybody has a quick question, make a very short question, tag me. I know I've missed all of your tags beforehand. Well, this was a spirited talk. I enjoyed it. Let's see if there's any questions.
Yeah, it's fun.
Come on, guys. If you have questions, you got to ask now. Maybe I asked every question that they wanted me to ask. PineCreek. That's not a question. It has to be a short question to Mike, not to me. I don't know if you want to answer this one, but Joachim West asks, how do we know that the Ebionites weren't the true original Christians? Could the early church fathers be mistaken or edit the books in their favor? Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, all that attestation we're talking about with Papias, they're not perfect, right? They're men. They're fallible. Right. They could have made mistakes. In fact, they could have flat out lied. Papias could have flat out lied and just made this up in order to bolster the church that he wanted to see thrive.
Possible does not mean probable.
Exactly.
And, not only, but that's what you're saying. That's what that person would seem to suggest. So I look at not only the testimony of Papias, I'm looking at the fact that others provide similar testimonies. And when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, I'm looking at Paul. I think he's our best witness for it. And then we can show historically, I've done it elsewhere, where Paul, we can show that he is preaching the same gospel message. That doesn't mean every detail, but he's the core of the gospel message. He is preaching the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles. So when he talks about the resurrection of Jesus and appearing to others and the nature of Jesus' resurrection being bodily, I think we can be quite confident that this is what Jesus' apostles who had walked with him were saying as well. So even if we didn't have the Gospels, we can still get to a bodily resurrection just from Paul.
I actually have noticed that when you debate non-believers, you use Paul, and when you're talking to Christians, you use the Gospels more. Am I wrong about that?
When we're talking about the resurrection, yeah, you'd be wrong. I almost always use Paul. Now, I do speak on the historical reliability of the Gospels and gospel differences. Gospel differences was something I spent 8 years doing. In fact, this year, I'm hoping to write a popular level version of that. No, when I speak on the resurrection, it's mainly Paul.
Yeah, and I think I know why. And it's because he's first-person witness. Camille Greger asks, what's the second best explanation for the resurrection? So assuming Jesus did not rise from the dead, what would be the second best explanation?
I would say I'd go with Geza Vermesh, the late New Testament scholar. He was a Jewish scholar, and he said there were six options he considered. He wrote off the resurrection because he said only the faithful believe it, which I think was a quick dismissal. Does that mean that there aren't any sophisticated arguments like from Gary Habermas, Bill Craig, and N.T. Wright? He didn't even deal with those. And then he wrote off just inveterate skepticism, he called it, because those skeptics will never believe regardless of the evidence. So he wrote that off too quick, because even if you're an inveterate, biased, completely biased atheist, it still could be that your arguments are correct. Just because you're biased doesn't mean you're wrong. So I think he too quickly dismissed both ends. And then he looked at the other four options and he said, none of these, like hallucinations, deceit, all of this, none of these work. So he concludes, we just don't have enough evidence to know what happened. So I think that that's probably where I would go if I knew for a fact that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or if I didn't believe he rose from the dead. I think that the next best one is going to be, we just don't have enough evidence to know what happened.
Why not choose the Chronicles of Narnia explanation? Have you ever heard that? Do you know what I mean by that?
No, but I'm guessing, are you saying it's fictitious?
I'm saying just like the Chronicle of Narnia it's set in, London near World War I or II. It has some truth in it, some history, but it's basically, the Chronicles of Narnia is basically a fiction based on the Gospels, correct?
Well, C.S. Lewis's son denied that it had anything to do with the Gospels. I think it had to do with the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Aslan is Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, what if the Gospels were the same way? What if the Gospels were written using the Old Testament as a template?
Okay. Well, I mean, that is possible. They could have been having the Old Testament in mind. I mean, you would expect that because they thought Jesus fulfilled prophecy. So they were interpreting the events in view of the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean they were inventing those events. The fact is, when we come to the resurrection, you have Paul, who in 1 Corinthians 15 is addressing the questions the Corinthians are asking him. They're saying, some here in Corinth are telling us that there's no afterlife, no resurrection. And so, how are the dead raised, and with what kind of body are they going to come? And then Paul just goes on to say, look, Jesus' resurrection was part of the general resurrection of which we will be raised. So if Jesus was not raised, we will not be raised. If we will not be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But Jesus was raised, therefore we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. That argument makes absolutely no sense if any part of the resurrection was fiction. He meant for us to understand that the resurrection was an event that occurred in history. And because of that, the Christian life is worth living. And because that was the essential part of his gospel proclamation, that can be traced back to the Jerusalem apostles, to them as well. So there's no reason to think that this whole thing was fiction, or
Well, I'm talking about the
a little bit of
Gospels.
history mixed with fiction.
I'm talking about the Gospels. I think it's
Okay.
it's more probable that people use previous texts to create stories and narratives loosely based on history than a man actually cursing a fig tree or healing the blind. Would you not agree that as a historian that one is more probable than another?
I think you have to take the whole thing into consideration and look at the evidence. I mean,
No, this is the flying man. We both agreed that the flying man goes into
When you're
fiction.
looking at the Gospels, if you're going to claim that they're ancient novels, well, ancient novels were almost always romances in which two lovers had to overcome obstacles. They only rarely included historical figures. And when they did, that historical figure, there isn't a single account of an ancient novel including a historical figure who had lived within a century of the writing of that. So the Gospels do not fit in the genre of fiction. They fit in the genre of ancient biography. It doesn't mean that everything in them is correct, of course, but they're writing in a historical kind of genre.
What's not correct if not everything's correct? Besides the zombies. Someone asked that question in the live stream. That's why when you said that, I thought of it.
Well, I don't think they're zombies. I mean, that's just a disrespectful way of talking about it that atheists use. Okay. But I think when we're talking about Matthew's raised saints, all right, I as you probably already aware, I take that as special effects. That is no different than what we find.
But is there anything else?
Using,
we're all aware
I don't know. I mean, there could be some errors in it. I don't know. I'm not saying one way or the other.
As a historian, what do you think? As a historian, your job is to figure out what probably happened in the past, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So is there any historical claim in the Gospels that you think probably did not happen in the past, other than the dead rising out of the graves in Jerusalem?
If something was meant to be interpreted historically, I can't think of anything right off that I would say I don't think that happened. I mean, you'd have to point out something, but I'll point out something. The cursing of the fig tree. I have to be honest at the same thing and said, I haven't done a historical analysis of every event that's reported in the Gospels. So I tend not to want to answer that question because I haven't done the study on it. What I have looked at is Jesus' death by crucifixion, his resurrection, a few other things. I think that these things happened. And, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, I might not be able to prove he walked on water, but it's not a big deal if you rise from the dead. I may not be able to prove a virgin birth, but if you rise from the dead, virgin birth is child's play.
I wager, I'm a betting man, I wager that if you and I were to spend the next 10 years together, not you and me, literally, it could be anybody, but going line by line and doing what you said you haven't done, line by line of, let's say, the Gospel of Mark, which is the first gospel I think you believe, right?
Yes.
I bet you could go line by line and show how a lot of it was taken out of the Old Testament. And
it may have been read and interpreted in view of the Old Testament. It doesn't mean it was invented, though.
Well, no, it wasn't invented. It was read exactly what you said, read and interpreted through the lens of the Old Testament. Just like the Chronicles of Narnia was read and interpreted through the text of the Gospels.
Yeah, but the Chronicles of Narnia are entirely fictitious.
But this is as a historian, this is our job, right? To figure out if it isn't fictitious or not.
That's just going to open up a whole new thing.
Yeah,
and
you're right.
But what I will say is, look, even though when you're talking about historians of Jesus, it's virtually unanimous among them, given the data, that that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that many, including Jesus and his disciples, interpreted as divine miracles and exorcisms. It's virtually unanimous among historians of Jesus, including skeptical ones. So they may not say that these were actual miracles. Some will deny the historicity of especially the nature miracles, but they all acknowledge that Jesus performed astonishing deeds, and these were interpreted as divine miracles and exorcisms. That's where scholars are today with this. So we could go line by line, and some of these things, Doug, I might say, look, Jesus probably did something like is reported here, or he probably did this. But I don't know that I would say, and of course, I don't know at all because we'd have to go line by line, whether I would come to the conclusion that there's something here in Mark that we would say this is completely fabricated out of whole cloth, that this did not happen. But anyway,
yeah, we got to
enjoy the conversation.
Yeah,
and,
I'm going to buy the
fun.
Resurrection of Jesus, or actually, maybe I'll buy your more recent book. But is there? You want to plug your website or anything before we go?
Sure, thanks. I'm at risenjesus.com. And we have a YouTube channel. Just type in my name, Mike Licona, Licona on YouTube, come up in channel. And there's videos, and a lot of them, like the debate with Ehrman, the debate with Matt Dillahunty. There's a lot of discussion on there, and 99.9% of the discussion is with hardcore atheists. So
which is your favorite debate so far?
You know, I really enjoyed that debate with Ehrman last year that I had on the historical reliability of the Gospels. That was just fun. I don't know that it was my finest debate. I think my finest debate might have been the written debate on the resurrection I had a year or two before that. But, you know, you have a lot more time to think through your answers rather than just talking off the cuff, you know, what comes to your mind at that moment. And so you really have time to think through it. The written debate on reliability of the Gospels with Ehrman, I think, was the best one. But the one last year was probably the most enjoyable one.
I think your strength is that you're a very likable guy. You have a good demeanor. I think you sincerely care about people and not just trying to win an argument. So that's what I appreciate about watching and listening to you.
Well, thanks, Doug. That's kind of you to say it. I appreciate that.
Okay, well, you have a great day. Sorry for going close to an hour and a half instead of an hour.
Not a problem. I enjoyed it. Take care.
See ya. Bye. I apologize to everyone who I apologize. I'm so sorry that I couldn't get to your questions. It's just like I was looking at some of the questions you guys were putting up there, and I'm going, this is going to take more than 5 minutes to answer. It's like if you're not going to ask a true or false question, it's not going to work. And even I tried, so. But if there were donations, thank you very much. I hope that at least some of your questions were answered through my questions. At 5 o'clock today. Hang on. Yeah, 4 o'clock Pacific. 4 o'clock Pacific, I'll be on Greg Kokel's show, his call-in show, for a full hour or a 40-minute segment. So I'm going to live stream it here, and so you'll just see my face and hear his voice. And I'm going to throw everything I have at Greg Kokel. Every hypothetical that's in my arsenal is going to come out, and maybe some other stuff. So we'll see what happens. Thanks, guys, for showing up this morning. Have a great day. We'll see you later.